Well, alright, it's time to round out our study of Unit 4 and talk about the nature of Southern society from 1800 to 1848. And I just need to tell you that if your little tum-tum gets squeamish about slavery, well, then go chug a bottle of Pepto-Bismol because there's a whole lot of it. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, so before we talk about slavery and its place in Southern society, let me just explain the general idea of Southern identity. And if you want it in shorthand, Southerners identified themselves as King Cotton, and that encompassed a few related strands. First of all, ever since the colonial period, the South was mainly agricultural, and in various eras they majored in indigo production or tobacco, etc. But during this period, the Southern geography and economy was dominated by the growth and export of cotton. And that reality was only intensified thanks to the widespread adoption of the cotton gin and the increasing availability of inexpensive land due to improved transportation and the forced removal of American Indians. And second, remember from earlier videos that during this period the US went through a cataclysmic economic upheaval known as the market revolution. And basically that development encouraged the growth of the national economy while simultaneously transforming America's regional economies. And its effect on regional economies was twofold, and although they seemed like opposites, the effects were more like two sides of the same coin. So on one side of the coin, the market revolution linked the regional economies of the North, South, and West into a tighter interdependent relationship. But on the other side of the coin, that kind of integration encouraged each region to become more distinct from the others by specializing in what they were best at producing. So the whole point is this: as a result of the market revolution, the South doubled down on cotton production and leaned into its distinct identity as the chief exporter of raw materials for the US and other international trading partners. And this fed into their sense of vital importance to the nation because they understood that their ability to produce cotton was a fundamental ingredient of the growth of the US economy. And with that, it's time to explore the Southern relationship with slavery, because without slavery, King Cotton was merely a common pauper. But before we do, since we're at the end of the unit, let me just mention that if you need help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May, then you might want to check out my APUSH Heimler review guide. It's got everything you need to study as fast as possible for your exam. So if that's something that you're into, then get that clicky finger out and check the link in the description. Well, alright, here we go. Let's talk about how slavery was understood to be a vital ingredient to the South and their way of life. Now, if you have the idea in your mind that every white person in the South lived on a massive cotton plantation and owned large groups of enslaved laborers, then smack that idea right out of your head, because that is not how it was. In fact, we can pretty neatly divide the Southern white population of this period into 4 distinct categories. First, there was a very small minority of elite wealthy planters who owned more than 50 enslaved workers. Second, there was another small minority of white planters who did not have the wealth or the sprawling acreage of the elite planters, but they did claim ownership over a few enslaved laborers. And then third was the vast majority of poorer white farmers known as yeoman farmers who worked their own land and could not afford even a single enslaved person. And then fourth, you had the poor whites who owned no land and simply hired themselves out to planters for seasonal labor whenever they could find it. So for our purposes, you just have to remember that only a tiny percentage of white Southern planters held black people in bondage, while a massive percentage did not. So when I say slavery was considered a vital ingredient in the Southern way of life, I reckon you should be growing a question mark over your head. And maybe if I put it in modern terms, it might be easier to understand. So as of the time of this recording, there exist in the United States something like 1,000 billionaires compared to a total population of about 340 million. Now, flying on private jets is a vital ingredient in a billionaire's way of life, because when you're that rich, you don't really want to mix with the lower class cattle that fly on commercial airlines. Anyway, what if this pitifully small number of billionaires began to claim that flying on private jets is the American way of life? In fact, if you don't fly on a private jet, then can you even call yourself an American? I mean, if they started saying that, I think the other 339,990,000 of us would be like, well, apparently all that cash didn't buy you any more brains, because that's the dumbest thing I ever heard. But that's kind of how it was in the South during this period. A very small handful of wealthy elites claimed that slavery was in fact a vital ingredient to the Southern identity, even though the vast majority of Southern whites could not relate in the slightest. But over time, those elite planters were able to convince the rest of the Southern white population that slavery was what made them who they were. And a significant reason they were so keen to convince everyone of this was because countries in Europe and South America began abolishing slavery, and states in the North were multiplying their own abolitionist movements. And to those Southern elites, abolitionism presented an existential threat both to their wealth and their social status. And so they launched efforts to unite all Southern white people against black Americans. And how in the world did they pull that off? Well, one strategy was to tighten the bonds between elite planters, yeoman farmers, and poor whites. And the elites did this by loaning them money in times of need and transporting yeoman farmers' goods to markets, etc. And in this way, the majority of whites in the South became at least socially indebted to the elite, but in many cases, they were financially indebted as well. And that meant they could not afford to fall out of favor with these large planters. Additionally, many yeoman farmers clung to the belief that one day they themselves would grow wealthy enough to own at least a few enslaved people. It was kind of like the Southern version of the American dream. But by far the most successful effort to unite Southern white society was the perpetuation of new ideologies, and there are two you need to know. First was the idea of white supremacy, which was the belief that the members of the white race, regardless of wealth, status, or education, were fundamentally superior to members of the black race. And again, this notion was not a given in Southern society before this period. Like prior to this, it wasn't unusual for poor whites to work with and be friendly with poor blacks since they had a lot in common on account of their shared socioeconomic status. But the notion of white supremacy shut down that kind of interaction by creating a racial division between the two groups. And that meant that even the poorest of poor white Southerners were at least wealthy in one respect, namely, they had won the genetic lottery, which is to say they were not black. But then the second ideology that united Southern whites and further diminished the status of enslaved blacks was the changing notion of the morality of slavery. Now, hopefully you remember from the last video that slaveholding founders like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and James Madison relied on slavery for their wealth, but they also believed it to be a morally repugnant institution and a fundamental contradiction to the notion of liberty. But I guess that conviction didn't cause them to lose too much sleep at night because none of them made any significant strides to push against the perpetuation of the institution. I mean, to be fair, they did seem to believe that as the United States grew, slavery would just sort of die out, but as I've established in multiple other videos, that is emphatically not what happened. Regardless, the point is, among elite slaveholders before this period, slavery was understood as a necessary evil. They didn't like it, some even thought it was immoral, but they believed that they had no choice but to perpetuate the institution, but perpetuate it with a guilty conscience. But during this period, Southern elites put the entire kibosh on that guilty conscience and turned the whole moral estimation of slavery on its head. Hereafter, slavery was no longer a necessary evil, but rather a positive good. Now, the clearest and most famous articulation of this position came from John C. Calhoun, whom you may remember as Andrew Jackson's vice president and the architect of the nullification crisis. And I won't get into any of that stuff here, but after Calhoun's tenure as vice president, he was elected to the Senate, and in 1837 he gave a speech called Slavery as a Positive Good. And in it, Calhoun rails against the anti-slavery movements raging in the North, and he takes aim at their insistence that slavery be abolished also in the South. And against such efforts, Calhoun countered thusly. First, because slavery in Southern society had been intimately intermingled since the very birth of the South, to abolish slavery would be to simultaneously abolish the South. And second, Calhoun argues that the venerated slaveholders of the previous generations who thought that slavery was a necessary evil were wrong. In fact, he argued slavery by all counts is a positive good. And he had his reasons for making such a claim. Like, not only did slavery provide the South with its very economic lifeblood, but he argued it also benefited the enslaved people themselves by raising these barbaric Africans to a higher level of civilization. And as strange as that might sound to our modern ears, here's where I tell you that Calhoun's arguments were widely accepted in the South because it seemed very plausible. What I mean is, Calhoun and those who agreed with him framed the institution of slavery in paternalistic terms. In other words, slave owners were to be exalted because they cared for their enslaved people. Like, they fed them and they clothed them, they taught them Christian values and all the rest. And that meant that slave-owning men and women positively overflowed with charity, since by their reckoning, enslaved people were not much different than children who could not survive on their own. And then further, Calhoun and his crew compared that reality with the brutal realities of wage labor in the North. I mean, look at all those industrial workers who were ill-treated and making next to no money to support themselves and living in nasty, squalid conditions. And so with arguments like that, many Southerners began to believe that slavery was actually the morally superior form of labor compared to free wage labor. And as a result, we can witness during this period the construction of a permanent wall of separation between the white and black people who lived in the South. And as planters continued to migrate west to find fresh land on which to plant their kingdom of cotton, they brought this positive good with them. And all this taken together meant that the South had fully developed a distinct regional identity centered on white supremacy and the perpetuation of slavery. And I hope you can begin to see how this is going to lead to a proper civil war in the next period. I mean, when an institution like slavery and ideas like white supremacy are baked into the very DNA of a society, and the leaders of that society preach the goodness of those things with evangelical fervor, well, compromise is simply not an option. Well, okay, since you likely have a test coming up, you can click here to grab my APUSH Heimler review guide, or you can click here to watch my other videos from Unit 4. I'm glad you came around, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.